The year was 1888. The city, London, England. In the early hours of August 31st, a cart driver named Charles Cross walked through the dimly lit streets of Whitechapel, the fog clinging to the gas lamps, the cobblestones slick from a light rain. He thought he knew these streets better than anyone until that night, when his footsteps slowed to a halt. On the ground before him lay the body of a woman. At first, it seemed like a drunk who had passed out, her clothes rumpled, her position awkward. But when Cross knelt closer, the moonlight revealed a gaping wound across her throat. Blood pooled into the cracks of the street. That woman's name was Mary Ann Nichols, the first in a series of murders that would terrorize London and leave behind one of the darkest mysteries in criminal history. Before we go further, let me ask you something. Right now, where are you listening from? And what time is it in your part of the world? Imagine hearing this story late at night when shadows in the room seem longer than they should be. What you're about to hear is not just another retelling of the infamous Whitechapel murders. This is a reconstruction of the case as it unfolded, step by step, crime by crime, an exploration into the psychology of both the killer and those who hunted him. And the question that has haunted generations: who really was Jack the Ripper, and why did he kill with such ruthless precision? The year was 1888. The city, London, England. In the early hours of August 31st, a cart driver named Charles Cross walked through the dimly lit streets of Whitechapel, the fog clinging to the gas lamps, the cobblestones slick from a light rain. He thought he knew these streets better than anyone until that night, when his footsteps slowed to a halt. On the ground before him lay the body of a woman. At first, it seemed like a drunk who had passed out, her clothes rumpled, her position awkward. But when Cross knelt closer, the moonlight revealed a gaping wound across her throat. Blood pooled into the cracks of the street. That woman's name was Mary Ann Nichols, the first in a series of murders that would terrorize London and leave behind one of the darkest mysteries in criminal history. Before we go further, let me ask you something. Right now, where are you listening from? And what time is it in your part of the world? Imagine hearing this story late at night, when shadows in the room seem longer than they should be. What you're about to hear is not just another retelling of the infamous Whitechapel murders. This is a reconstruction of the case as it unfolded step by step, crime by crime, an exploration into the psychology of both the killer and those who hunted him. And the question that has haunted generations: who really was Jack the Ripper, and why did he kill with such ruthless precision? London in the late 19th century was a city of contradictions. By day it thrived, with industry, commerce, and imperial pride. But by night, Whitechapel transformed into a very different world. Overcrowded lodging houses, alleys thick with smoke and refuse, gangs roaming the streets, and poverty so extreme that death was often preferable to another night of hunger. In this grim setting, thousands of women were forced into prostitution just to survive. They were anonymous, disposable in the eyes of society, and for one predator, they were the perfect victims. Mary Ann Nichols, known to friends as Polly, was 43 years old. A mother of 5, estranged from her husband, she had drifted into the slums after years of hardship. Her last night alive was unremarkable. She drank in a public house until she was turned away for lack of money. She promised friends she'd earn a few pennies on the street to afford a bed at her lodging house. But instead she encountered someone else, a man whose name would never be known, but whose shadow would loom forever over history. The discovery of Nichols' body was not at first treated as extraordinary. Whitechapel was plagued by violence, and murders of women, especially sex workers, rarely drew headlines. But there was something unsettling in the sheer brutality of her wounds. The police surgeon's notes described not only the slit throat but cuts across her abdomen, as though the killer had lingered after death. This was the first clue that London was facing something it had never seen before: a killer who murdered not for robbery or revenge, but for reasons far darker. The official investigation began that very morning, with Inspector Frederick Aberline assigned to lead the case. Aberline was seasoned, respected, and methodical, but what he would soon discover was that this crime was only the beginning, because within weeks more bodies would appear. and each one would be mutilated more savagely than the last. Before we dive deeper, I'll ask you this. If you were alive in 1888, walking those same fog-choked alleys, would you have felt safe? Or would you have known instinctively that a predator was lurking in the dark? Let's continue. The killing of Marianne Nichols set off ripples of unease across Whitechapel, but at first, few imagined a serial predator. The working poor were accustomed to violence. What disturbed the police, however, was the surgical nature of the wounds. Aberline's report noted that the cuts seemed deliberate, almost practiced as though the killer had anatomical knowledge. This theory immediately unsettled the community. Was the murderer a butcher, a doctor, someone who lived among them, appearing ordinary by day but slipping into the streets at night with a knife? Nichols' murder triggered the first wave of fear-driven speculation. Local newspapers fanned the flames, publishing lurid details that suggested the killer might be hunting prostitutes specifically. The term leather apron began circulating based on rumors of a violent man known to threaten women in the district. But this would prove to be only the first of many false leads. And yet, as August bled into September, unease hardened into dread, because soon another woman would die. Her name was Annie Chapman, 47 years old. Like Nichols, she lived a transient, fragile existence. On September 8th, just after 6:00 a.m., her mutilated body was discovered behind a house in Hanbury Street. The injuries this time were far more grotesque. Chapman's throat was cut in the same brutal fashion, but her abdomen had been slashed open. Organs were missing. The medical examiner, Dr. George Baxter Phillips, concluded that the killer had not only murdered but performed a kind of grotesque operation. It was precise, intentional, calculated, and suddenly the police could no longer deny the possibility. London was dealing with a serial killer. This was the moment the case shifted. It was no longer a simple murder inquiry. It was a hunt for a man who killed with purpose. A man who, in the shadows of Whitechapel, was just beginning. What drove this figure to kill so savagely and to escalate so quickly? Was it a hatred for women, a need for control, or something far more chilling, a fascination with anatomy and death itself? The answer, as we'll see, would plunge London into chaos. By early September of 1888, Whitechapel was no longer simply uneasy, it was gripped by terror. 2 women dead, both mutilated, both sex workers living on the margins of London society. The press seized on the story with feverish intensity. Newspapers that once ignored crimes in the East End now splashed the murders across their front pages. They described the scenes in graphic detail, stoking both fascination and horror. Suddenly, everyone had an opinion on the identity of the killer. Yet one fact unsettled investigators more than anything else. Annie Chapman's murder had occurred in a yard that backed onto tenement houses, with windows overlooking the spot. The killer had risked discovery. He had killed in near daylight. That recklessness suggested one of 2 possibilities. Either he was desperate and unhinged, or he was confident that no one would stop him. And he was right. Whitechapel was a place used to hardship, but the atmosphere shifted in those weeks. Women refused to walk the streets alone. Men were questioned by neighbors if they returned home late at night. Suspicions spread like smoke. The East End had always been stigmatized by London's wealthier classes as a den of vice and crime. Now the murders reinforced that prejudice. Editorials in the Times suggested the killings were the inevitable result of poverty, disease, and immorality in the district. Politicians debated whether to impose stricter controls on lodging houses and brothels, but for those who lived there, survival was the only concern. If a woman could not sell her body for a few pennies, she would starve. And so, despite the fear, many continued to work, the streets aware that at any moment they might meet the same fate as Polly Nichols or Annie Chapman. This was the cruel paradox of Whitechapel. Fear kept them indoors, but hunger drove them back out. For Inspector Frederick Aberline and his team, the pressure was immense. The police were accused of incompetence, of failing to protect the most vulnerable citizens. The newspapers taunted them daily, demanding results. but the investigation faced obstacles at every turn. Crime scenes were chaotic, often contaminated by curious onlookers before police arrived. Forensic science as we know it today barely existed. Fingerprinting would not be introduced in Britain until the 20th century. Detectives were left with little more than witness statements and crude sketches of footprints. One witness, a woman named Elizabeth Long, claimed she had seen Annie Chapman speaking with a man shortly before her murder. She described him as foreign-looking, with dark hair and a shabby appearance. But in Whitechapel, such a description could have applied to hundreds of men. Still, the police clung to this detail. Was the killer an outsider, an immigrant, or was he hiding in plain sight? Every unanswered question deepened the panic. It was in the weeks after Chapman's death that the name we now know so well began to emerge. Letters started arriving at police stations and newspaper offices written in red ink, signed with a chilling signature, Jack the Ripper. The most infamous, known as the Dear Boss letter, taunted the authorities, mocking their inability to catch him. It promised more killings, described with grotesque humor. Most historians today believe it was a hoax, written by a journalist seeking sensational headlines, but in 1888, the effect was immediate and devastating. The public believed that the killer had named himself, and once a name takes hold, it becomes a legend. Jack the Ripper was no longer just a faceless murderer. He was a character, an idea that haunted the imagination of Londoners. And he was far from finished. On the night of September 30th, 1888, the Ripper struck again, not once, but twice, in what would become known as the double event. The first victim was Elizabeth Stride, a 44-year-old Swedish immigrant. At around 1:00 a.m., her body was discovered in Dutfield's yard. Her throat had been slashed, but unlike the earlier victims, there were no mutilations. Some investigators believe the killer had been interrupted. Witnesses reported seeing a man with her minutes before she was found, but the descriptions varied. Some said he was respectable, others claimed he was rough-looking. No one could agree. While police were still reeling from Stride's death, another body was discovered less than an hour later. This time, the victim was Catherine Eddowes, 46 years old, found in Mitre Square. Her injuries were far worse. Like the others, her throat was cut, but her abdomen had been savagely opened. Parts of her face were mutilated, and again organs were missing. The juxtaposition was horrifying. One victim spared mutilation, the other defiled more grotesquely than ever before. Had the killer intended both murders from the start, or had he been denied satisfaction with Stride, driving him to find another victim that very same night? This escalation left investigators shaken. It also left London convinced that Jack the Ripper was not merely killing, he was playing a game. Near the site of Eddowes' murder, police discovered a piece of her blood-stained apron discarded in a doorway. Above it, scrawled in chalk, was a message: "The Jews are the men that will not be blamed for nothing." The words sparked controversy. Some believed it was a clue, perhaps even written by the killer. Others thought it was a random graffito, unrelated to the crime. But in a city already bristling with anti-Semitic tension, the inscription inflamed suspicion toward the Jewish community. Fearing riots, the Metropolitan Police Commissioner ordered the writing erased before dawn. To this day, it remains one of the most debated pieces of evidence in the case. Had the Ripper left behind a message, or had the police destroyed the only direct clue to his identity? By October, fear consumed London. Vigilance committees were formed, groups of citizens who patrolled the streets at night searching for suspicious figures. Pamphlets circulated warning women not to venture out alone. Rumors spread that the Ripper might be a surgeon, a foreign sailor, even a member of the aristocracy. Meanwhile, the victims' funerals were attended by crowds of mourners. For women like Nichols, Chapman, Stride, and Eddowes, life had been marked by poverty and anonymity. But in death, they became symbols of a city's failure to protect its own. The press, the police, and the people were united in one thing only: an obsession with the Ripper's next move, and they would not have to wait long. With 4 women dead in barely a month, and the killer seemingly unstoppable, The city asked itself what would come next. Would the Ripper grow bolder still, or would he vanish as suddenly as he had appeared? The answer would come in November, with a murder so brutal it would shock even the most hardened investigators. By the end of September 1888, London had endured what the press chillingly dubbed the Autumn of Terror. 4 women dead in barely 5 weeks. The killer had struck twice in a single night, leaving behind a trail of horror and unanswered questions. But the city's nightmare was far from over, because in early November, Jack the Ripper would commit the murder that defined his legacy, a killing so grotesque, so unimaginable, that even hardened detectives would be scarred for life. This is where the case escalated from fear into sheer horror. The Metropolitan Police were in disarray. Commissioner Sir Charles Warren faced unrelenting criticism from the public and the press. The discovery of the chalk message after Catherine Eddowes' murder had become a scandal. Many accused Warren of deliberately erasing a vital clue. Others accused the police of incompetence, or worse, of protecting someone powerful. Inside the investigation, Inspector Frederick Aberline worked tirelessly, interviewing dozens of witnesses, chasing countless leads. But every path led to a dead end. Suspects were arrested, questioned, and released. Witness statements contradicted each other, and the sheer brutality of the murders made profiling nearly impossible in an age when criminal psychology was still in its infancy. The only certainty was this: the killer was still out there, and he would strike again. Doctors involved in the case began to debate the Ripper's mind. Some believed he was a sadist, deriving pleasure from the mutilations. Others argued that he was motivated by anatomical curiosity, that he was collecting organs with clinical precision. Dr. Phillips, who examined Annie Chapman's body, insisted the killer had medical knowledge. But others disputed this, claiming the cuts were clumsy. This conflict left the police with no clear picture. Was the Ripper a deranged lunatic stumbling through the alleys? Or was he a calculating predator who studied his victims with cold intent? That uncertainty made him all the more terrifying, because if he was the latter, then he wasn't just killing, he was experimenting. Unlike the previous victims, Mary Jane was younger, just 25 years old. She was Irish by birth, strikingly pretty, and lived in a small room at 13 Miller's Court, a lodging house off Dorset Street. Unlike Nichols, Chapman, Stride, and Eddowes, Mary Jane was not killed in the open streets. She had a private space, and it was there that she met her end. On the night of November 8th, 1888, Mary Jane was seen drinking with friends, cheerful and lively. Witnesses later claimed they saw her with a man, a figure described variously as stout, pale, or shabbily dressed. But as with all prior sightings, the descriptions were inconsistent. By dawn on November 9th, neighbors heard singing coming from her room, her voice drifting through the thin walls. Then silence. Later that morning, her landlord's assistant, Thomas Bowyer, was sent to collect overdue rent. When he knocked and received no answer, he peered through the window. What he saw froze his blood. The police were summoned immediately, but nothing could have prepared them for the scene inside. Mary Jane Kelly lay on her bed, her body unrecognizable. Her throat had been slashed, her abdomen torn open, her face mutilated beyond recognition. Flesh was scattered around the room. Organs had been removed and placed beside her. This was not a quick killing in the darkened streets. This was prolonged, deliberate, and ritualistic. The killer had taken his time. Inspector Aberline, hardened by years on the force, later admitted the scene was the most horrifying he had ever witnessed. Doctors present at the inquest struggled to put the brutality into words. If the earlier murders suggested frenzy, this one suggested obsession. News of Mary Jane Kelly's death spread instantly, igniting panic across the city. The press described the scene in grotesque detail, warning that no one was safe, not even behind locked doors. The public's outrage boiled over. Demands for answers became deafening. Some accused the police of incompetence. Others whispered conspiracies that the killer was a surgeon protected by influential allies. The newspapers, desperate for circulation, pushed sensational theories daily. Some suggested the Ripper was a foreign sailor. Others claimed he was a butcher who worked at the nearby markets. A few even suggested royalty. The hysteria reached fever pitch. And in the middle of it all was Inspector Aberline, exhausted, overwhelmed, and no closer to catching the killer. The police threw everything they had at the case. Hundreds of extra officers were deployed. Rewards were offered. Known criminals and vagrants were rounded up and questioned. Yet nothing concrete emerged. Witness descriptions conflicted. The letters signed Jack the Ripper poured in by the hundreds, most obvious hoaxes, but some convincing enough to waste precious time. Even the doctors could not agree. Some said the mutilations required surgical skill. Others argued that anyone with a steady hand and a sharp knife could have inflicted them. The frustration was palpable. Each unanswered question made the case darker. Each theory collapsed under scrutiny. And still the murder stopped. Mary Jane Kelly's murder is widely believed to have been Jack the Ripper's final confirmed killing. After November 1888, the trail went cold, but the terror lingered. Whitechapel never fully recovered. For months, women refused to walk alone at night. Vigilance committees continued their patrols, and the legend of the Ripper only grew. He had killed at least 5 women, perhaps more. He had taunted police and terrified an entire city. And then he had vanished, leaving behind only speculation and unanswered questions. Why did he stop? Did Jack the Ripper die, flee, or simply choose to end his killing spree? Or was Mary Jane Kelly's murder not the end at all, but simply the last killing we could ever prove? The investigation, however, did not end here. What followed was a desperate search for suspects and a tangle of false leads, red herrings, and theories that continue to this day. By November of 1888, the Ripper murders appeared to have ended, but the investigation did not. The brutality of Mary Jane Kelly's killing left the police desperate for answers, while the public demanded justice. Fear had not vanished, it had transformed into obsession. Everyone wanted to know, who was Jack the Ripper? Inspector Frederick Aberline, though shaken by the Kelly case, continued his tireless pursuit. Dozens of men were interrogated, hundreds of leads were followed, and yet no single figure could be tied definitively to the crimes. The biggest challenge? The Ripper left no clear evidence behind. He killed in silence, vanished into the alleys, and never revealed himself to his victims' friends or neighbors. His murders were both public and invisible, a paradox that baffled detectives. What Aberline and his colleagues were left with were suspects, and the suspect list grew longer each day. One of the first serious suspects was John Pizer, a local man nicknamed Leather Apron. Known to intimidate prostitutes and carrying a violent reputation, he seemed to fit the profile. Witnesses even claimed to have seen him near the crime scenes. But when Pizer was brought in, he provided solid alibis. The police cleared him quickly, yet newspapers had already splashed his name across the headlines. For weeks, he was branded as the Ripper in the public imagination, proof of how desperately people wanted a face for the terror. Another suspect was George Chapman, born Surin Kosowski, a Polish barber. Years after the murders, he was convicted of poisoning 3 women. Some investigators retroactively linked him to the Ripper killings, arguing his violent tendencies may have started earlier. Yet there was no concrete evidence. Was Chapman truly capable of the surgical mutilations seen in Whitechapel, or was his later notoriety enough to make him an easy scapegoat? From early in the case, doctors were suspected. The precision of some wounds led investigators to believe the killer had anatomical knowledge. One prominent suspect was Montague John Druitt, a barrister and part-time schoolteacher with a troubled mind. Druitt was found drowned in the Thames in December 1888, just weeks after Mary Jane Kelly's death. His suicide fueled speculation that he had been the Ripper, ending his life after his final crime. But evidence against Druitt was circumstantial. He had no proven ties to Whitechapel, no direct links to the victims. Still, his timing dying as the murders stopped kept his name in the suspect pool for over a century. Another was Dr. Thomas Neal Cream, a convicted poisoner who murdered women using strychnine. When he was hanged in 1892, legend claims his last words were, "I am Jack the," before the trapdoor fell. Yet Cream had been imprisoned during the Ripper killings, making his involvement nearly impossible. The fascination with doctors highlighted something deeper. People feared that the killer wasn't a raving lunatic in the slums, but an educated man, someone respected, someone hiding behind a mask of civility. The investigation was riddled with misdirection. Witnesses described the killer as tall, short, fair, dark-haired, shabbily dressed, well-dressed, contradictory images that muddied every lead. Letters kept arriving, signed Jack the Ripper, many filled with grotesque jokes or promises of future murders. Most were proven hoaxes, but they consumed police resources. Vigilance committees offered rewards, hired private detectives, and even staged night patrols. But they too found nothing. At times, it seemed as though the Ripper himself was shaping the investigation, whether through letters, deliberate misdirection, or simply his ability to vanish into London's labyrinth of alleys. The deeper police searched, the less certain they became. For ordinary Londoners, the identity of the killer was less important than the feeling of helplessness. If the police could not protect them, who could? Fear turned into paranoia. Every stranger was suspect. Neighbors watched each other with suspicion. Jewish immigrants, already marginalized, were targeted by mobs, accused of harboring the murderer. At the same time, the press turned the murders into a gruesome spectacle. Penny papers sold in record numbers. Illustrations of the crime scenes, often exaggerated, circulated across the city. For the working poor, the victims became tragic symbols. For the middle class, the Ripper became a kind of bogeyman, a reason to fear the slums they rarely entered. Jack the Ripper was no longer just a man. He was a myth being written in real time. One particularly chilling element of the investigation was the suggestion that the Ripper stalked his victims long before killing them. Several women reported being followed through Whitechapel by men who disappeared when challenged. One prostitute claimed the man offered her money to accompany him, only for her instincts to scream danger she fled, and later heard of Nichols's death. Were these encounters near misses with the Ripper himself, or were they the result of a city where fear painted every shadow as monstrous? The uncertainty fed the terror. At any moment, the killer could be behind you, watching, waiting. It is impossible to separate Jack the Ripper from the newspapers that covered him. The press not only reported the crimes, they shaped the narrative. It was the newspapers that popularized the name, that printed lurid illustrations, that speculated wildly about motives and suspects. In some ways, the Ripper was the first media serial killer. His fame spread not because of his body count, others had killed more, but because of the way his crimes were told. And with every headline, his legend grew stronger. By the close of 1888, London had endured 5 brutal murders, countless suspects, and endless speculation, yet still no answers. Had Jack the Ripper vanished forever? Or was he merely waiting for the world to forget, preparing to strike again? The next chapter in our story reveals how the case evolved in the years that followed through cover-ups, conspiracy theories, and the slow transformation of a murderer into an enduring myth. By the winter of 1888, London had entered a strange state of relief mixed with unease. The killings appeared to have stopped after the murder of Mary Jane Kelly, but relief quickly gave way to doubt. Was it truly over? Or had the killer simply moved on, hiding in another city, another country, waiting for the right moment to strike again? The streets of Whitechapel were quieter, but the shadow of the Ripper lingered, and in that shadow, theories began to flourish. After November, no further murders were officially linked to the Ripper. A handful of killings in early 1889 bore similarities, but none matched the signature brutality. Police records showed dozens of investigations into suspicious deaths, but none provided the same certainty as the so-called canonical 5. And so, the official stance hardened. The Ripper's spree had ended, but the absence of resolution left a void that conspiracy theories rushed to fill. One of the most enduring theories suggested that Jack the Ripper was not a poor laborer or a foreign sailor, but a member of the upper class. The story centered around Prince Albert Victor, the Duke of Clarence, grandson of Queen Victoria. Rumors spread that the prince had secretly married a Catholic commoner and fathered a child. The women murdered in Whitechapel, according to this theory, were silenced because they knew too much. Supporters of the theory claimed that the mutilations were deliberate distractions designed to obscure the real motive. They They suggested that senior officials, including Sir Charles Warren, orchestrated a cover-up. While historians widely dismiss this as myth, it reveals a deep truth. People struggled to accept that such horrors could be the work of an ordinary man. The crimes felt too theatrical, too monstrous. Surely some believed the hand of power was behind them. Another theory pointed to Walter Sickert, an artist who lived in London during the murders. Known for his dark and unsettling paintings of grim lodgings and prostitutes, Sickert fascinated later investigators. Some claimed his works concealed references to the Ripper crimes. Author Patricia Cornwell famously argued in the late 20th century that Sickert had been the killer, even funding DNA tests on old letters. The evidence was inconclusive, but the theory gained traction because it fit a chilling narrative: the Ripper as an artist, turning murder into a grotesque performance. But again, evidence was lacking. Sickert may have been eccentric, but eccentricity alone does not make a killer. Perhaps the most unsettling theory was that the Ripper was part of the police force itself. The precision of his escapes, the way he seemed to vanish after killings, the lack of reliable eyewitnesses all suggested he knew how to avoid patrols. Some whispered that he had access to police timetables. Others believed the authorities deliberately protected one of their own. If true, it would explain why the investigation failed so utterly. But like the other theories, it remains speculation, built on gaps rather than facts. As years passed, Jack the Ripper became more than a criminal case. He became a cultural obsession. Penny Dreadful's cheap illustrated booklets turned him into a character, mixing fact with fiction. He appeared in plays, in sensationalist pamphlets, in the whispered conversations of Londoners. And as the myth grew, the victims themselves began to fade into the background. Mary Ann Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes, Mary Jane Kelly. Their lives were complex, filled with struggle and survival, but history remembered them primarily for how they died. This erasure remains one of the darkest legacies of the case. The Ripper became immortal, while his victims became footnotes. The failure to catch Jack the Ripper had lasting consequences for British law enforcement. The case exposed the limits of Victorian policing, the absence of forensic science, the reliance on eyewitnesses, the lack of coordination between different police divisions. Public outrage forced reforms, slowly pushing Britain toward more modern investigative methods. In many ways, the Ripper murders were a turning point, highlighting the gap between what criminals could do and what detectives could prove. But for the men who worked the case, Abilene, Warren, Phillips, the failure haunted them. They had faced the most infamous killer of their age and emerged with nothing. Though never caught, attempts to profile Jack the Ripper continued long after 1888. Some experts described him as a disorganized killer, striking with frenzied violence, driven by uncontrollable impulses. Others argued he was methodical, hunting carefully, choosing locations with precision. Modern profilers often suggest he was a local man, blending into Whitechapel, someone who could approach prostitutes without raising suspicion. His hatred seemed focused not just on women, but specifically on those marginalized by society, making them both vulnerable and invisible. The mutilations, the organ removals, the escalation, they all pointed to a man consumed by obsession, not a crime of passion, not robbery, something darker, something that suggested killing was, for him, an end in itself. In the decades after the murders, the obsession never faded. Each anniversary brought new articles, new theories, new books. The Ripper case became a puzzle people longed to solve, even knowing it was unsolvable. For Londoners in 1888, Jack the Ripper was a flesh-and-blood killer who stalked their streets. For us today, he is both that and a symbol of unsolved mystery, of fear that lingers in the dark corners of history. But what if Jack the Ripper didn't simply vanish? What if his killings extended beyond the canonical five? Could there have been more victims unrecognized, forgotten, buried in the chaos of Whitechapel's poverty? In the next part, we explore the possibility of other murders, the overlooked cases, and how the Ripper's shadow may have stretched further than anyone realized. By late 1888, officials and the press were convinced the Ripper's spree had ended. 5 women, 5 brutal killings was the canonical story. But in the alleys of Whitechapel, whispers told a different tale. Some believed the Ripper had killed more than 5, that his crimes stretched back before Mary Ann Nichols and forward long after Mary Jane Kelly. If true, then the shadow of his terror was even darker than history records. To understand this theory, we must look earlier months before the canonical 5. On April 3, 1888, a woman named Emma Elizabeth Smith was attacked in Whitechapel. She survived long enough to describe her assailants as a group of men before dying of her injuries. Police dismissed her case as gang violence. But some researchers argue the brutality of her wounds hinted at something more sinister. Could this have been the Ripper testing his impulses for the first time? On August 7, 1888, just weeks before the first canonical murder, Martha Tabram was found stabbed 39 times on a stairwell. No organs were removed, but the ferocity of the attack shocked investigators. Some modern experts believe this was the Ripper's first kill, a clumsy attempt before he developed his infamous signature. If these women were indeed his victims, the Ripper's reign of terror had already begun months earlier than the public believed. But if so, why were they forgotten? Even more unsettling are the cases after Mary Jane Kelly's murder. In December 1888, Rose Milett, another prostitute, was found strangled. Authorities declared it suicide, yet many in Whitechapel were convinced it was another Ripper killing, disguised to throw off suspicion. In July 1889, Alice Mackenzie was discovered with her throat slashed. The wounds bore similarities to earlier cases, but the mutilations were less severe. Police argued the differences proved it wasn't the same killer. But what if the Ripper was changing his methods, adapting to avoid capture? And in February 1891, Frances Coles was found dying beneath a railway arch, her throat cut. A man named James Sadler was arrested, but acquitted due to lack of evidence. The murder remains unsolved. Some investigators quietly admitted they believed these later crimes could be connected. But officially, the police were eager to declare the Ripper gone, perhaps because admitting otherwise meant admitting their failure continued. Serial killers rarely stop on their own. This is one of the great mysteries of the Ripper case. Did he truly vanish after 5 killings, or was his violence scattered among other unsolved cases, hidden in plain sight? The theory of escalation suggests that killers grow bolder, more frenzied over time. Mary Jane Kelly's murder, the most brutal of all, fits this pattern. But if escalation was inevitable, why would the Ripper end there? Some argue he didn't, that he shifted tactics, targeting women less publicly, leaving behind fewer clues, that the police, desperate to move on, ignored connections. It's easy to criticize Victorian detectives for failing to connect these cases, but in 1888, there was no fingerprinting, no DNA analysis, no blood typing. Investigators relied on witness accounts, crude autopsies, and educated guesses. When faced with killings that were similar but not identical, they often chose the simpler answer, different killers. But today, with modern understanding of serial offenders, patterns emerge. The targeting of vulnerable women, the geography, most victims found within a narrow radius, the timing, murders often occurring late at night, on weekends, patterns that suggest a single hand. If the Ripper had more victims, what does this reveal about his mind? Psychologists suggest that early kills, like Martha Tabram, show practiced violence, an attempt to find satisfaction, followed by frustration. The canonical 5 show refinement, as if he had found his ritual. Later kills, like Alice Mackenzie, suggest either a loss of control or an attempt to reassert dominance after lying dormant. Killers sometimes return to crime when stress, failure, or obsession overwhelms them. This paints the Ripper not as a phantom who vanished, but as a man bound to his compulsion, surfacing, retreating, resurfacing again. Perhaps the most chilling thought is this: Whitechapel was a place where death was common. Women disappeared without notice. Bodies were found with little investigation. How many murders were simply missed? How many victims were dismissed as accidents, suicides, or drunken brawls? The Ripper may have had far more victims than history records. Women whose names were never written down, whose deaths were barely acknowledged, And that anonymity, that erasure, was his perfect camouflage. The uncertainty over the true body count keeps the Ripper alive in our imaginations. If we could list every victim, perhaps the case would feel closed, containable, but instead we are left with ambiguity. 5 canonical murders, and possibly many more. A killer who may have vanished, or who may have blended his crimes into the noise of Whitechapel's misery. The doubt itself became part of the legend, because what is more terrifying than knowing there was a killer, not knowing when or if he truly stopped? But there is another angle we have not yet examined, not just the murders, not just the theories, but the wider stage on which these crimes unfolded. What was it about London in 1888 that allowed Jack the Ripper to thrive? Was it only the darkness of one man, or the reflection of an entire city's neglect and decay? In the next spot, we step back from the crime scenes and examine the world of Whitechapel itself, the environment that bred fear, silence, and opportunity for the Ripper to reign. Up to this point, we've examined the murders, the investigation, and the theories surrounding Jack the Ripper. But to truly understand why these crimes shook the world, we need to step back and look at the stage upon which they were committed. Whitechapel, London, in 1888. This was not just a backdrop, it was a critical factor in why Jack the Ripper could exist and why he could evade capture. Whitechapel in the late 19th century was overcrowded, filthy, and impoverished. Narrow alleys twisted between lodging houses and taverns. Thick fog and the glow of gas lamps turned night into an indistinct blur of shadows. Over 0 people crammed into this small district, many of them immigrants, laborers, or the unemployed. Streets overflowed with refuse. The stench of rotting waste mixed with coal smoke, beer, and desperation. It was a place where anonymity thrived. A killer could vanish into the crowd, and a scream could be dismissed as drunken quarrel. The women who became victims of Jack the Ripper were not chosen at random. They were women living on the very edge of survival. In Whitechapel, prostitution was not glamorous. It was often the last resort for women who had lost their husbands, their homes, or their health. For just a few pennies, they could afford a bed in a doss house for the night. Without those pennies, they slept on the streets. Mary Ann Nichols, Annie Chapman, Catherine Eddowes, Mary Jane Kelly. Each of them had histories of hardship, abandonment, and resilience. Their lives tell us as much about Victorian society as their deaths do about their killer. These were women society ignored until they were murdered. Victorian London was dotted with workhouses, grim institutions where the destitute could earn food and shelter through grueling labor. For many, the shame of entering a workhouse was worse than the hunger of the streets. Instead, thousands turned to lodging houses. For a penny, you could rent a spot on a rope stretched across a room where you slept sitting up, leaning forward. For 4 pennies, you might get a shared bed. Conditions were squalid. Vermin, disease, and violence were rampant. These were the places where the Ripper hunted. He knew his victims would be desperate for a few coins. He knew no one would notice when one of them failed to return. Whitechapel was also a district of immigrants. Jewish refugees fleeing pogroms in Eastern Europe settled there in large numbers. Irish migrants, too, filled the streets, competing for scarce jobs. This influx fueled resentment and prejudice. Whenever another woman was killed, suspicion fell on foreigners. Anti-Semitic riots erupted after the Goulston Street graffito, with mobs convinced the Ripper must be an immigrant. This xenophobia distracted from the investigation. While crowds demanded the arrest of outsiders, the real killer moved unseen among them. The people of Whitechapel did not trust the police. To them, the authorities represented distant power, not protection. Officers patrolled sporadically, often harassing the poor rather than protecting them. When the murders began, cooperation was minimal. Witnesses lied or stayed silent. Rumors spread faster than facts. Some even believed the police themselves were involved in the killings. This atmosphere of suspicion gave the Ripper an advantage. Every clue was doubted, every statement contested. The truth was lost in a fog of mistrust. The rise of cheap newspapers meant that every murder was reported in lurid detail. The press turned Jack the Ripper into the first media-driven serial killer. Illustrations showed exaggerated scenes of gore. Headlines screamed of "The Monster of Whitechapel." Journalists fabricated letters from the Ripper, heightening fear and boosting sales. But the media frenzy also distorted reality. Facts were buried under speculation. Witnesses sought attention, and the killer himself, if he read the papers, may have taken satisfaction in the panic he caused. In many ways, the press gave Jack the Ripper his immortality. Without them, he might have been remembered as just another London murderer. With them, he became a myth. Victorian society judged harshly. Women who sold sex were considered fallen, sinful, undeserving of sympathy. This moral prejudice colored both public opinion and police priorities. When Mary Ann Nichols was murdered, one newspaper wrote, "A woman of no great worth is gone." That single sentence captures the callousness of the time. These women were seen as disposable, which made it easier for their killer to keep hunting. The indifference of society may have been Jack the Ripper's greatest accomplice. Every element of Whitechapel in 1888 aided the killer. The narrow lanes gave him escape routes. The poverty-insured victims were available. The mistrust of police hindered cooperation. The press amplified his legend, and society's disdain for poor women ensured little urgency in protecting them. The Ripper was not just a murderer. He was a murderer shaped by his environment, an environment that made his crimes possible and in many ways invisible. So, was Jack the Ripper an extraordinary monster or simply an ordinary man who thrived in extraordinary conditions? And if the city itself helped create him, does that mean London itself carries part of the blame? In the next part, we examine the suspects. Dozens of names have been suggested across the years, but who are the men most seriously considered, and how close did investigators come to unmasking him? We've seen the murders, the investigation, the fear that gripped Whitechapel, and the social forces that let the Ripper thrive. But one question towers above all others. Who was Jack the Ripper? Over the past century, more than 100 suspects have been named, ranging from paupers to princes, lunatics to doctors. Each theory offers compelling details, and each collapses under scrutiny. Tonight, we sift through the most infamous suspects, peeling back rumor from possibility. Montague John Druitt was a barrister and part-time schoolteacher, respectable, educated, middle class, but in December 1888, just weeks after Mary Jane Kelly's murder, his body was pulled from the River Thames, suicide by drowning. Why was Druitt suspected? Some claimed he suffered mental instability. His family reportedly noted serious trouble before his death. A police memorandum written years later mentioned a doctor's son who was strongly suspected, fitting Druitt's profile. But evidence against him was circumstantial. He lived miles from Whitechapel. No witnesses placed him near the crimes. His death may have been unrelated despair, not guilt. Still, some insist Druitt's suicide was the final act of a killer, unable to suppress his urges or escape capture. Aaron Kosminski, a Polish Jewish barber, was admitted to an asylum in 1891. He suffered from paranoid schizophrenia, hearing voices, refusing to eat food prepared by others, fearing constant persecution. Police records from the time note Kosminski as a strong suspect. His residence placed him near the heart of Whitechapel. He matched descriptions of a man seen with some victims. Decades later, DNA testing on a shawl linked to Catherine Eddowes supposedly pointed to Kosminski's maternal line. Critics dispute the reliability of the sample, but the claim revived his profile as a leading suspect. If true, Kosminski was a tragic figure, a mentally ill immigrant scapegoated by a city desperate for answers. But did his illness make him capable of such precise escalating violence? That question remains unsettled. A Russian-born conman and thief, Michael Ostrog had a long criminal record. Authorities at the time described him as a dangerous lunatic. He was named in official police documents as a possible Ripper, but evidence collapses under scrutiny. Ostrog was repeatedly imprisoned during the murders. Records show he may not even have been in England in 1888. His name persists largely because the Ripper legend demanded foreign menace, a convenient villain even when facts disagreed. Cream was a doctor with a deadly history. Convicted of poisoning, he targeted women across 2 continents, executed in 1892. Legend claims his final words were, "I am Jack the," before the hangman cut him short. But this story is almost certainly false. Cream was in prison during the Ripper murders. Still, the rumor endured because it fit so well. A doctor, a killer, a man who preyed on women. His case highlights how much of the Ripper story is shaped by myth, not evidence. Francis Tumblety, an American quack doctor, was arrested in London during the Ripper scare for unrelated charges. He was flamboyant, eccentric, and openly misogynistic. He collected anatomical specimens, including preserved female organs. His documented hatred of women, combined with his bizarre lifestyle, made him a prime suspect. But after his release, Tumblety fled to America. The murders stopped, or at least no new ones were linked directly to the Ripper. Did his departure explain the sudden silence? Or was he simply a convenient suspect, his eccentricities magnified by suspicion? In the 1990s, a supposed diary emerged, allegedly written by James Maybrick, a Liverpool cotton merchant. The diary contained confessions to the Ripper murders alongside intimate details. Initially hailed as a breakthrough, the diary was later denounced as a forgery. Ink testing, handwriting analysis, and inconsistencies destroyed its credibility. Yet the Maybrick theory lingers in popular culture because it gave the Ripper a voice, even if it was a fabricated one. Each of these men, Druitt, Kosminski, Ostrog, Cream, Tumblety, Maybrick offers part of the Ripper's puzzle: mental illness, hatred of women, medical knowledge, geographic proximity, sudden disappearance. But no suspect fits perfectly. Each theory is riddled with contradictions, missing evidence, and leaps of assumption. Perhaps that is why the mystery endures. The Ripper case is not a locked box waiting to be opened. It is a shattered mirror, pieces scattered, some sharp, some misleading, none forming a whole. Years after the killings, senior officers wrote private memorandums naming their personal suspects. Sir Melville Macnaghten favored Druitt, Ostrog, and Kosminski. Chief Inspector Swanson annotated his copy with notes pointing squarely at Kosminski. Inspector Aberline, who led much of the fieldwork, doubted these choices entirely. The very men who lived the investigation could not agree. And so the uncertainty calcified into legend. What becomes clear, after more than a century of theories, is that the Ripper case resists certainty. Every time new evidence emerges, it unravels under closer inspection. Every time a suspect rises, another detail pushes him aside. This absence of closure may be the most haunting truth of all. We will never know who Jack the Ripper was, and perhaps that's why his shadow has never faded. But beyond suspects and speculation, what do we actually learn about society itself from the Ripper case? What does this obsession with the unknown killer say about us, the living, who keep his memory alive? In the next part, we turn to the legacy of Jack the Ripper, how his crimes reshaped law enforcement, inspired endless cultural fascination, and revealed the darkest corners of human psychology. Jack the Ripper was never caught. His name, his face, his true story lost to history. Yet more than a century later, he remains one of the most infamous killers the world has ever known. The murders themselves lasted just a few months in 1888, but the impact has lasted generations. To understand why, we must look at what the Ripper left behind, not in Whitechapel's alleys, but in the institutions, the imagination, and the fears of society. The Ripper murders exposed the weaknesses of Victorian policing. At the time, investigative work was crude. There were no crime scene cordons, bystanders, and journalists often trampled evidence. Photographs were rare. Medical knowledge was limited. Detectives relied on confessions, eyewitnesses, and luck. The Ripper case forced reforms. Over the following decades, fingerprinting was adopted, forensic pathology advanced, building on lessons learned from botched autopsies. Police training improved, with emphasis on coordination between divisions. In many ways, the Ripper murders were the crucible in which modern criminal investigation was forged. His crimes made clear that old methods were no match for new horrors. The inability to solve the case haunted doctors as much as detectives. If they had possessed the forensic tools we have today, DNA, blood typing, toxicology, the Ripper might have been caught. That haunting absence fueled a century of innovation. Criminologists often point to the Ripper as the spark for the idea of criminal profiling, attempting to understand not just what a killer does, but why. The notion that one could read psychology from a crime scene, now a staple of investigation, emerged from the frustration of not being able to unmask Jack the Ripper. Before 1888, serial murder was not a recognized concept. People spoke of madmen, of lunatics, of crimes of passion. The Ripper case forced society to confront something new, a killer driven not by money or revenge, but by compulsion. Psychologists have since studied the Ripper endlessly. Was he a sexual sadist, a paranoid schizophrenic, a man with deep-seated hatred of women, or simply someone who discovered pleasure in killing and could not stop? While answers remain speculative, the Ripper case helped define the very category of the serial killer, a phrase that would not exist until nearly a century later. Perhaps the most enduring legacy lies in how the Ripper was covered by the press. The murders coincided with the rise of cheap newspapers. For the first time, horrific crimes could be reported daily to mass audiences. Illustrations, headlines, and rumors spread faster than facts. Jack the Ripper became the first global media criminal. Within weeks, his name was known not just in London, but in Paris, New York, even Australia. The template he created, sensational headlines, speculation, anonymous letters, has shaped crime reporting ever since. Every notorious killer since has lived in his shadow. From novels to films, from plays to conspiracy theories, Jack the Ripper has inspired endless retellings. He appears as a monstrous villain, as a tragic madman, as a symbol of social decay. His story is rewritten again and again, sometimes with accuracy, often with invention. The irony is cruel. His victims, real women with real lives, are often overshadowed by his myth. Jack the Ripper became immortal, while Mary Ann Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes, and Mary Jane Kelly remain remembered mainly for how they died. This imbalance raises a chilling question. Has society given the killer what he wanted, attention, fear, and immortality, while neglecting those he destroyed? Why does Jack the Ripper still fascinate us? Partly, it is the unsolved mystery. We are drawn to puzzles without answers, but it is also the psychological pull of darkness. The Ripper embodies our fear that evil can hide in plain sight, that the man walking beside us could harbor unspeakable desires. And beyond fear, there is a kind of grim comfort. By studying Jack the Ripper, we place boundaries around chaos. We try to understand the incomprehensible, to impose order on the void. But the truth may be that the Ripper resists understanding, and that resistance itself is what keeps us returning to his story. For London, the Ripper murders were more than crimes. They were a wound to the city's identity. They exposed the squalor of Whitechapel to the world, shattering the illusion of imperial grandeur. They showed that beneath the wealth of Victorian progress lay deep poverty, neglect, and human suffering. The killings forced London to confront itself, and in many ways, that confrontation continues to this day. Ultimately, Jack the Ripper is both myth and man. The myth is clear, the faceless killer, the shadowy figure, the eternal mystery. The man, however, remains hidden, somewhere in Whitechapel in 1888. A real human being walked, breathed, killed. A man with habits, desires, fears, a history. A man who returned home after each murder, washing blood from his hands. That duality, the myth towering above, the man lost below, ensures the story's grip on our imagination. But one final question remains: what became of the man himself? If Jack the Ripper was never caught, where did he go? Did he die suddenly, his secret buried with him? Did he flee, carrying his darkness to another city? Or did he live out an ordinary life, hiding behind a mask of normalcy while history turned him into a legend. In the final part, we explore the possible fates of Jack the Ripper and confront the chilling reality of why his story still matters today. We've examined the murders, the investigation, the suspects, the legacy, and the haunting questions. But one mystery still lingers above all. What became of Jack the Ripper himself? Did he vanish into death, prison, or madness? Or did he simply walk away, blending back into ordinary life, never to be unmasked? Let us consider the possible fates of history's most infamous killer. One theory suggests that the Ripper died soon after his killings. Montague John Druitt's suicide in December 1888 fits this narrative. If Druitt was indeed the Ripper, his death explains why the murders stopped so abruptly. But others argue the killer may have died anonymously, struck by illness, accident, or poverty. Whitechapel was filled with death. One more corpse would hardly have drawn notice. If true, then the Ripper carried his secret to the grave, leaving the world only with unanswered questions. Another possibility is that the Ripper was confined, locked away, not for murder, but for lesser crimes or madness. Aaron Kosminski, admitted to an asylum in 1891, never again walked free. His delusions worsened until his death decades later. If he was the Ripper, his confinement explains the sudden end to the killings. Others argue the Ripper could have been jailed under another name, lost among the hundreds of petty criminals packed into Victorian prisons. A man who once terrified the world reduced to an anonymous inmate. The silence after 1888 may not have been choice, it may have been enforced. Perhaps the most chilling possibility is that the Ripper did not stop at all, that he left Whitechapel behind, carrying his violence to another city, another country. In the 1890s, reports of Ripper-like killings surfaced in places as distant as New York and Chicago. None were definitively linked, but the similarities fueled speculation. Did the Ripper reinvent himself, adjusting his methods to evade suspicion? Could his crimes be scattered across the world, unconnected, each city believing its killer was unique? If so, then Jack the Ripper's story is far bigger than we imagine and far darker. And then there is the most unsettling theory of all, that Jack the Ripper simply stopped. Some killers burn out, their compulsion fading, their risk outweighing their desire. Others find substitutes, fantasies, rituals, obsessions that replace the act of murder. If this was true, then perhaps the Ripper walked away from Whitechapel and lived the rest of his life in complete normalcy. A neighbor, a tradesman, a father. Imagine it. The man who disemboweled women by night might have smiled politely at children by day. He may have died of old age, surrounded by family, his secret never known. This possibility is the most terrifying because it suggests evil can hide not in monsters, but in men who look just like anyone else. Jack the Ripper remains unsolved not because the clues were never there, but because they dissolved into the fog of Whitechapel. Witnesses contradicted themselves, evidence was trampled, theories overwhelmed facts. In the end, we are left with fragments. 5 women brutally murdered, perhaps more. A handful of suspects, none proven. A legacy that reshaped policing, psychology, and culture. And above all, a faceless man whose shadow stretches across centuries. What does his story truly mean? That one man can terrorize an entire city. That society's neglect can make victims invisible. That myths can outlive truth. And that sometimes the darkest mysteries are the ones we will never solve. So I leave you with this. Do you believe Jack the Ripper was a deranged outsider, doomed by madness, or an ordinary man who hid his darkness behind a mask of normal life? Which is more terrifying, the monster we imagine or the neighbor we never suspect? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. If you found this journey into history's darkest mystery compelling, consider subscribing to Dark History HD. Every week, we uncover chilling true crime stories, forgotten murders, and unsolved mysteries that still haunt us today. Don't forget to like this video, share it with others who love investigative storytelling, and hit the notification bell so you never miss an episode. Together, we'll keep shining a light on the shadows of the past.